Imagine walking into your registrar's office and asking for the right to vote, and then having to answer questions such as how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, how many seeds are in a watermelon. The Reverend Hosea Williams said it best: if you can't vote, you're a slave. We lost one of the greatest freedom fighters for voting rights in the U.S. Congressman John Lewis. The best way that we can honor John Lewis is to exercise our right to vote. Many more before him gave the ultimate sacrifice. Men and women such as James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, Viola Liuzzo, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and others. 55 years later, their sacrifice. Imagine walking into your registrar's office and asking for the right to vote, and then having to answer questions such as how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, how many seeds are in a watermelon. The Reverend Hosea Williams said it best: if you can't vote, you're a slave. We lost one of the greatest freedom fighters for voting rights in the U.S. Congressman John Lewis. The best way that we can honor John Lewis is to exercise our right to vote. Many more before him gave the ultimate sacrifice. Men and women such as James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, Viola Liuzzo, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and others. 55 years later, their sacrifice and their honor still rings true today. It showcased to America that the right to vote was still an issue. Of all the previous elections that we've had in our country before, none are more important than today.
However difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth testers will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever.
We have to vote like our life depends on it, because it does. Imagine an America where one person, one vote is truly a reality.
Hi, I'm Terry Freeman, President of the National Civil Rights Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program. Tonight, Keepers of 306 is hosting its second in a series of town hall programs. This evening's program is Where Do We Go From Here? Economic Justice. Keepers of 306 is a group of young professionals who are committed to maintaining and pushing forward the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This evening's program, you'll hear issues that are facing African Americans and people of color around economic equity and economic justice, as well as hear some solutions. I hope you enjoy this evening's program. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, President Freeman. Good evening. I am Travia Chapman, Chair of Keepers of 306, and we are once again thankful to the National Civil Rights Museum for partnering with us to bring you Where Do We Go From Here? Economic Justice. Part one of this series brought awareness concerning the importance of voting activation and civic engagement. The goal was for viewers to understand that voting is our power and our voice. While voting is detrimental and non-negotiable, it is not the only tool to overcome years of intentional oppression. Tonight, we are going to expose the systemic economic injustice that continuously plagues communities of color. Generational poverty was created, period. Dr. King knew it, and his last act of service was to demand fair pay for sanitation workers right here in Memphis, Tennessee. He lost his life fighting for the essential worker, and yet here we are in the midst of a health crisis, still fighting for our livelihood. As communities continue to march for justice and police reform, we must also take into account the policing that has taken place in the pockets of communities of colors for years. From redlining, Levittown practices, discriminatory appraisals, you name it, barriers to wealth building are shackles that continue to keep communities of color bound. Communities of color must galvanize and move forth fearlessly to birth new businesses, increase home ownership, revitalize neighborhoods, and not gentrify. And vote those in power that will push forth common sense policies that will support generational wealth. Yes, it is time to collaborate, combine resources, and buy the block. From Memphis to Atlanta, from DC to Chicago, from LA to the smallest towns across the country. It is time to recreate, time to reimagine. It is time for economic justice for all.
Good morning. I'm Terrence Southern. I reside in Dallas, Texas. I'm the founder and executive director for Illuminate STEM, where the STEM stands for Sustaining Talent and Elevating Minds. I'm also the president of my own consulting firm, Horizon Tech, where we do consulting with for educational curriculum and automation strategy. For a long time, I looked into how I can make an impact in my community and what was necessary to prepare the youth of our communities for the future. As a person who's been in the robotics and automation industry for the last 20 years, it's been an exciting journey to be a mentor and a guide and influence to young people across the globe. We started Illuminate STEM because at the time early in my career, I realized I was the only Black person in robotics across the country. I felt like it was my mission to get something started, and we did just that.
Did you know 70% of people who work for tips are women? Did you know employers can pay a base wage to tipped workers as low as $2.13 an hour? Did you know that this lower wage is a legacy of slavery? My name is Diana Ramirez, and I work at the National Women's Law Center. I'm an advocate for gender, racial, and economic justice because I'm a first-generation Mexican American born and raised on the border who lived these struggles. At the National Women's Law Center, we advocate for one fair wage so that employers can't pay anyone less than the full minimum wage before tips, and families can make ends meet. One fair wage has already been adopted in 7 states, and we see that tips are higher, sexual harassment is lower, restaurants do better, and economic equity increases. A $15 minimum wage with one fair wage was already passed in the House of Representatives, but not the Senate. We will keep fighting until one fair wage is a reality across the country, and we hope you will join us.
Hello, my name is Philip Ashley Ricks, founder of Philip Ashley Chocolates right here in Memphis, Tennessee. One of the things that is really important to me is entrepreneurship, and particularly Black-owned businesses and building Black wealth and having equitable opportunities when it comes to developing businesses, growing businesses, and passing those businesses along to the next generation. I'm self-taught in chocolate. It took me several years to master the craft, but that was the key thing. I worked on mastering the craft in really working through the obstacles and pushing through the challenges and overcoming those challenges. And one of the things that I've learned and kind of has been my mantra is saying, people want to buy into you before they buy from you.
Hello, my name is Shalonda Spencer, and I'm from Mississippi. I'm a community activist and policy analyst. When I think of economic justice, I automatically think about Black women. We all know that this is an election year, and Black women has the highest voting turnout amongst any gender in this country. Yet we only make 62% on a dollar. So why this election is important is because we need people to truly stand up for Black women, not just hear us or see us, but give us our equal pay for our equal work that we contribute to this country and also to our democracy. So I would like to champion, for those of you who are listening, to ensure that we elect people who are willing to fight for Black women and champion for us when it's time to create policies when it comes to economic justice.
My name is Daryl Cobbins. I'm president of Universal Commercial Real Estate, a 13-year-old commercial real estate services firm here in Memphis, founded in 2007. I'm also a third-generation real estate professional. My grandfather, Samuel Peace, founded a company called Peace Realty in 1959 and ran that company for 50 years here in Memphis. I was able as a young person to watch him as an entrepreneur, as a leader in the community, as a father, as a husband, and as a business leader, forge forth and give opportunities to people that look like him, building communities that represented opportunities for folks that look like him to move into new parts of Memphis. And I'm proud to have inherited that legacy. I think it's important that young people see examples of what they can be, and my grandfather was certainly that for me.
My name is Mary O, and this is Ken, and we are the owners of Mother's Coffee House in Memphis, Tennessee, more specifically, Whitehaven, Tennessee. We want to tell you today about our journey into coffee and how Mother's Coffee House began. It started in an idea at our kitchen table for a coffee shop in the community where we grew up. Whitehaven is a place that is near and dear to us as we spent all of our childhood years and adolescent years. And so the idea was to put something in the community that would be an asset to the community and be a place where people could come and enjoy a great cup of coffee. One thing about entrepreneurship is you have more control over what you can bring to the community. We enjoy that we can create a new vision just for the Whitehaven community.
Keepers of 306 and the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee present Where Do We Go From Here? Economic Justice, with special guests Dr. Noel Trent, Dr. Andre M. Perry, Stephanie Brown James, Dr. Rashawn Ray, and Dr. Stacy L. Spencer. I am Curtis Melrose, junior musical theater major from Howard University, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator for the evening, Tracy Potts, senior Washington correspondent for NBC News.
As long as there is poverty in this world, no man can be totally rich, even if he has $1 billion. That was Dr. Martin Luther King in 1961. That was 59 years ago. And that wealth gap still exists today in America. The question that we want to address and talk about tonight and find solutions to tonight is, what do we do about it? Dr. King called for all of us to be a part of that solution. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight at this town hall to talk about economic justice for what the Poor People's Campaign says are 140 million Americans who are either poor or low wealth families. Again, a solution that must be sought by all of us. Dr. King's dream was not only for racial and social equality, but economic equality as well. And tonight we're going to talk about where we are, the challenges, but we also want to look forward and talk about where do we go from here? What are the solutions for poor people, for people of color, families of color, communities of color, and how do we identify and replicate the successes that we do have in this country? First, let's lay a foundation. Let's talk a little bit about some background that I think will be helpful for tonight's conversation. I would like to introduce to you Dr. Noelle Trent. She is the Director of Interpretation, Collection, and Education for the National Civil Rights Museum.
Social justice conversation, those are the things that you can see. Everybody enjoys those things. But that economic conversation, that gets a little bit deeper, and it challenges the notions of society. I think that's why Dr. King had so much resistance with the Poor People's Campaign. You're asking us to reimagine poverty and now say that a poor person isn't poor because they're lazy. They're poor because they're a part of a system that disempowers them and prevents them from earning money in an equitable fashion. It requires us to confront some things and some very hard truths. And I think that we're in a space where we can do that. You know, there are way more Black bankers, Black financial planners than we've ever had. These are folks who are training at some of the top firms in the country who know this and who want to come out and understand this. And so I think it's being open to that conversation. I think part of the Fight for 15 campaign and the Living Wage campaign is rooted in this economic justice, that where people are looking, particularly Black and brown people, are looking at what's happening. There's some inequities there that people are seeing and saying, wait a minute, it's all well and good for us to have this social justice thing, but there's some economic things that need to come through. We've got some recompense to make here. I think that's part of the paradox of being Black in America, right? That's what we call the paradox of liberty, right? That there are limitations on how far you can go. That's not to say that we don't appreciate allies and allies aren't needed in this fight, but there's something that's fundamentally happens when, you know, the image of a Black person with some sort of authority, particularly economic authority, is viewed as intimidating, regardless of what he or she says and does. And the fact that there are white individuals who see that, perceive that, are intimidated by that, and then react to that. I think there are so many things to learn. I think there's the subtleties of white privilege that I think people will be open to exploring. And I think it holds up a mirror to folks to be able to examine that. But there's also something about the strength of Black women and Black men and our relationships that are valued right now in this moment. And I think it will be a balm for a lot of the pain that people are experiencing right now.
Thank you, Dr. Trent. It really does come down to relationships and so many different things that we deal with today. I would like to introduce to you tonight our keynote speaker, Dr. Andre Perry. He's a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, which is a scholar in residence at American University. He is also a columnist for the Hechinger Report and author of the new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. He's a nationally known and respected commentator on many of the issues that we'll talk about tonight: race, structural inequality, education. His research focuses on that. And he has mapped racial inequalities in housing and income. So he has a lot of information and a wealth of experience to share with us. Dr. Perry, we welcome you tonight.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. And also thank you, Terry and Trevia, for the work here. This is important. You know, the wealth gap is about 170,000 median income for white families, and it's about 17,000 for Black families, about 10 to 1. And when people look at that wealth gap, they often say, oh, that's because people aren't working hard, or people aren't doing the right things. They're not educated. They're not financially literate. But as was stated in the introduction in the beginning, policy created that wealth gap. And there's this white supremacist myth that the conditions in Black cities and neighborhoods are a direct result of the people in them. But I have news for people that policy created those gaps. So I want to at least give the folks viewing today a sense of how that racial wealth gap occurred and its impact. So if we can start the slideshow, we can get moving here. So please start the slides. A lot of this data you can find in my new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this is a chart looking at home values by the population of Black people in a neighborhood. It's hard to see, but on the bottom axis, on the horizontal axis, that's the percentage of Black folk in a neighborhood. As the percentage of Black people increases, the prices of homes decreases. Homes in neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is less than 1% are on average priced at about $340,000, and about half as much in areas where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%. And people will say that's because of education, crime, and other factors. But those are things you can control for in a study. Next slide. And that's what we did. We controlled for structural characteristics. So we looked at the same kind of homes and room sizes, and we controlled for education, crime, walkability, and all those fancy Zillow metrics you see. Next slide. And what we found is pretty astonishing. Homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. And I want to be clear about this. This is equivalent homes in Black and white neighborhoods, an apples to apples comparison. Next slide. Accumulatively, there's about $156 billion in lost equity in Black neighborhoods. $156 billion. Next slide. And this is occurring all across the country, including Memphis. You can see the magenta circles, that's where the valuation is occurring. Wherever you see those green circles, that's where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced more. Next slide. Memphis, Tennessee, 22% difference, about 24,000 per home difference. Next slide. And you can see here in some places it's as high as 81% difference. Rochester, New York, 65%. Nashville, plus, now there are places, as I said, where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher. In Nashville, Tennessee, homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher than their white counterparts. Next slide. But I just want to put this $156 billion in lost equity in perspective. Next slide. It would have funded more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount Black people use to start their firms. It would have financed more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a public four-year degree. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over, covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's doubled the economic burden of the opioid crisis. 156 billion is a big number. Next slide. This is why I say all the time that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. It's even on my t-shirt that you can get from Bailiwick Clothing in Washington, D.C. But the point here is that we have to stop blaming people for the conditions in Black cities. We need to address policy that create these conditions. Next slide. Now, I want to show you a clip from when I testified on Capitol Hill on this very issue. Now, this is Representative Al Green of Texas, and he's questioning me and the appraisal industry on whether or not there's discrimination in housing. Now, if there's one thing we have a lot of evidence for, it's around discrimination in housing. Listen to this.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that Black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now. We're getting some consternation, I see.
So I showed this to see what we're up against. Now, again, of all the issues, sectors that we know that there's discrimination, is housing. And yet there's a denial of this. Next slide. And this impacts business because most people start their businesses using the equity in their homes. Next slide. And you can see the numbers as a result of this loss in home equity. We represent about 13% of the US population, but only 2% of the nation's employer businesses. Only 1% of Black business owners are able to obtain a loan in their founding year compared to 7% of white owners. Black entrepreneurs are denied bank loans more than twice as often as their white peers. Next slide, please. And when we do get loans, we get higher interest rates. About half of Black businesses survived the Great Recession compared to 60% of white-owned firms, and 95% of Black-owned businesses did not receive PPP loans as part of the CARES Act. Next slide. So I wanted to look at why, and I wanted to remove quality from the equation. So what we did was a similar study around housing. We looked at business revenue, but we scraped the Yelp data from all the businesses in the United States. And Yelp is a great consumer reporting mechanism that gives you a sense of quality. But then we controlled for things like the spending power in communities, education. So we wanted to get an apples to apples comparison between businesses. Next slide. And what we found is Black, brown, and Asian owned businesses are actually rated higher than their white counterparts, but next slide. But they get fewer ratings and less revenue. Next slide. And that's because they're getting less customers, but it's not because of quality. The red line in the magenta line there represents minority-owned businesses. And the gray line represents white-owned businesses. Again, as the share of the Black population increases, the number of Yelp reviews and the ratings decrease, but Black, brown, and Asian-owned businesses still rate higher. Next slide. That's costing high-quality businesses close to $4 billion a year. $4 billion a year. Next slide. There's a saying that the elders used to say in the hood. They used to say, our ice is just as cold. They knew when you bypass quality in your hood, you suppress the economic mobility in that neighborhood. The high quality businesses become forced to compete with low quality businesses, and there's just less revenue in the neighborhood. But they had that wisdom. They knew that the issue of the conditions in our Black city wasn't the result of our homes, wasn't the result of our businesses, their quality, but it is the result of negative perception, a negative narrative of Black people. Next slide. Now, there are ways to counter this, and I hope we get into some of these solutions. We absolutely need direct capital to homeowners and business owners. On the right-hand side of that slide, you see invest in places. Certainly, I want to invest in place. But if you invest in place and not people, you essentially encourage gentrification. And that's what's occurring all in the United States. Investments in brick and mortar and not people. So we need investments in people. And we also need to remove the unnecessary bureaucratic barriers for entry into entrepreneurship for Black folk. Next slide. And that concludes my talk. But the reason why I show these slides, and the reason why I say that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve, is because this issue of economic inequality in this country is not because of us. It's not. And we need to internalize that, believe that, so that we can project that to the outside world and address the policy failures that suppresses Black growth. So I'm looking forward to this wonderful panel conversation, and thank you for allowing me to present to you today.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. So you really laid it out. I mean, you gave us a great foundation for this conversation. I learned a couple of things. First of all, I need to get on Yelp and support all of my favorite Black and brown businesses, right?
That's right.
Not that, their ice is just as cold as you said. It's just that they're not getting that promotion that continues to drive more customers in. So that was telling. So we've got some other people that we want to bring into the conversation. That was a great introduction to what I think our guests can add tonight. I want to bring in Stephanie Brown James, who really comes at this from a grassroots organizing perspective. She is a community organizer and an entrepreneur who has dedicated her life to empowering people, to organizing, advocating for justice. I like to say nothing about us without us. And I thought about that when I was reading your bio, really empowering people to help create their own solution. She is the CEO and founding partner of Vestige Strategies. This is a public affairs firm in Washington, D.C. that specializes in grassroots and community and civic engagement. So I'm looking forward to bringing you into the conversation. Dr. Rashawn Ray, who is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, also professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research right here in my area, University of Maryland, College Park. Also one of the co-editors of Context Magazine. Your research focuses on mechanisms, so we're going to talk about those policies and those big picture things again, that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, and addressing racial uplift activism. I want you to remind me to define that as part of our conversation tonight. So thank you for being here. And we also want to bring in Dr. Stacy Spencer, senior pastor of New Direction Christian Church in Memphis, Tennessee, with affiliates in Tennessee and also in South Africa. So a global message you're bringing us tonight, addressing the spiritual growth of individuals, but also society. But while you've got your hand on the Bible, you've also got your hand on the dollar, because you've also done a lot of things in the community there, including the development of Eden Square Town Center, which is a multi-million-dollar community model. And I'm going to leave it right there because I want you to spend a little time explaining to us the success of that and also how we can replicate that. I think that's a big part of our conversation here. Dr. Perry laid it out. We know what the challenges are. I think you gave us some really good historical and current context and numbers to put with it. But I think we really benefit when we talk solutions. Where are those good examples? How do we replicate them? How do we identify the policies and the barriers that need to come down? So I'm going to start with Dr. Ray, who told me that you want to set a big picture here. And here's my question to you. We talk a lot about social justice and racial justice, certainly, right, since the spring. And my question is, show us where's that connection with the social justice issues that so many of us are so passionate about and the economic justice issues that we're talking about tonight?
Well, Tracy, I'm so excited to be here this evening. It's always great to be with my Brookings colleague, Dr. Andre Perry. People should completely go get his book to look at what is happening in Black cities and what we can do about it. You know, this is pretty interesting to me because I went to college at the University of Memphis and I'm from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. So when I see what Dr. Perry just highlighted, both of those spaces speak to me very, very well. I remember going down to the slave auction block in downtown Memphis and then walking to the Lorraine Motel to kind of chronicle Black people's lineage in Memphis, Tennessee, going to the place where Dr. King was assassinated. And I would always remember, after being exuberant and being excited from what was shared at the National Civil Rights Museum, I remember riding back down Popular, Union Avenue, and then being able to see a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest that is no longer there. But in that moment, that speaks to what happens in a place like Memphis, how you can be in one area and all of a sudden feel empowered. And then a few blocks away, all of a sudden you can feel deflated and marginalized, because that's what segregation does. I also remember riding down Ridgeway on Sunday morning through a church and then a bubble, a white bubble, as the church had outgrown that place very quickly. And I used to hear a young, exciting pastor who I knew was just next level amazing. That happened to be Dr. Pastor Stacy Spencer, who set a foundation for myself and my wife as we grew in our relationship. And I think about all of how these things come together. And I think about how Rhodes College, off the Parkway, the way that segregation manifests there, how you can literally see the ramifications of that, where there are streets that have been blocked off, where, as people know, after the riots in the late 1960s, after MLK was assassinated, a train would come on the railroad tracks and literally block off Black people from being able to go to the other side of the tracks. And even still, sometimes that happens oftentimes in what's going on. Dr. Perry laid out the way that Black areas are devalued. And in Memphis, we also see that in education, where we have Memphis City schools, and then we have Shelby County schools. And we see the differential impact that has. Nationally, there was a report, and part of the money that Andre highlighted wrapped up in that non-white school districts have $23 billion less annually now than predominantly white school districts. So we oftentimes see the way the segregation manifests in the places where we can shop, in the places where we can go to get treatment for health, in the places where we can actually frequent for businesses, and also our overexposure to policing. So as we think about MLK and the fact that he was in Memphis, highlighting the Poor People's Campaign, highlighting what was happening with poverty, as people were walking around with "I am a man" signs, it brings us to the point of what we can do about it. And I think an oftentimes quote that's left out of what MLK says from the March on Washington, which is about America is giving the Negro people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. But we shouldn't necessarily think that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. And this is the reason why Andre and I wrote a signature piece on reparations, because as you look at the solutions to dealing with racial inequality, and Andre highlighted that 10-to-1 gap, when people are college educated, it doesn't go away much. It becomes 7-to-1. White college graduates have 7 times more wealth than Black college graduates. That's not because Black people aren't working hard. That is literally because systemic racism is baked into everything that happens, from the types of loans we get, whether or not we go to Howard University or Lemoyne Owen College, compared to going to Rhodes College or, say, University of Maryland. And then we know that we are more likely to be in neighborhoods that are devalued. When our houses are appraised, we end up getting 30 to 40% sometimes less value on our home. People like D.L. Hughley has even highlighted this with himself. And so when it comes to solutions, reparations, I think, is one of the only ways to truly end systemic racism.
Okay, thank you. So you've done a great job of painting that big picture. And I want to juxtapose that with the work that Stephanie Brown James does in terms of affecting community. So what does this look like on the ground? What does it look like to go into a community that has been devalued, a community that is facing barriers, and to empower people to really try to create their own solutions, right? Because, I love that quote. I know I said it, but I really did think about it with you, nothing about us without us, because we bring in programs and we bring in people, but how do you empower people in their own communities to start to deal with this?
Well, thank you for that question, Tracy. And it's really an honor to be a part of this conversation with these brilliant gentlemen. It's funny, I was just preparing for another panel a couple of days ago, and I was relying upon the statistics from Dr. Ray to prepare me for that conversation. So to now, a few days later, be a part of this conversation with him and Dr. Perry and Dr. Spencer and you, Tracy, is really an honor. And I want to thank Dr. Terry Freeman and Trevia for this opportunity. Because, we really are in that season where we're talking about power. We're talking about how we can empower the communities, but empowering so that we can have the power we need to create the progress that we continue to need to make. And so I actually take a lot of my work from the perspective these days around politics. And I know that this is a nonpartisan conversation, and so I will keep it as nonpartisan as possible. Because when we look at, and Dr. Perry actually referred to some of this in his presentation, so much of the systematic barriers and challenges that face us in this country comes down to policies. And when we look at many of the changes that we have seen throughout the years in this country, they were done because Black people continue to push forward so that we could have the political representation and participation in the process so we could have policies that would move our communities forward. And you look today, there are currently in this country, 90% of all elected officials are white. It's a stat that's so unbelievable given how diverse this country is. But this was a study done by the Women's Donor Network to show that 90% of all elected officials are white. Of course, we know the majority of them are white men, and 95% of all prosecutors are white. That's very important in the conversations we're having around police misconduct and the need for criminal justice reform. And if you look at the highest office in the land, down from the White House, you look at Congress. Congress decides many of the laws that blanket this country. There are currently, as there in the Constitution, 535 members of Congress. 55 of them are Black. Now we're actually in a position this year where if 2 additional Black folks are elected this year and the number becomes 57, we've reached parity in the political representation of Black people in Congress. But as we all are beginning to, I think, feel more so today, so many of the laws that impact us on a daily basis, from the quality of the water that we drink to how much police budgets are to what kind of curriculum is in our public school education, is dictated by who makes the rules, who are the lawmakers on the local and state level. There are 346 statewide positions across this country. Only 18 of those are held by Black people. So we have a lot of work to do when it comes to political representation, and it's important because as we're talking about these systematic barriers to progress, we need to have people in office that reflect and respect Black people. And when we don't have that, we're limited in our conversations around the progressive and the changes that we need to make. If we don't have folks who are the lawmakers making the laws to make our lives better. And then, and I think we'll touch on this before, but so much of this conversation, it is about money. And so, yeah, people are going to say, well, why are there only 18? Well, there's only 18 statewide elected officials because it costs a lot of money to run a race. We currently have no Black governors in this country. Out of 50 states, there are no Black governors. We know that 3 Black folks tried in 2018. They were not successful, but you have to raise almost $20 million to run for governor. In order to run for an attorney general seat, there are currently 6 Black attorney generals in this country. Only one of them is a Black woman. You have to raise over $3.5 million. For the ones that just were put in office, many of them in 2018, the Black candidates, they on average raised $3.8 million. They had to go above and beyond. And then finally, a lot of, we're saying that this is the year of the Black candidate. We have a record number of Black people running for Congress, more than we've ever had. To run for Congress, you have to raise almost $3.4 million. If I am a teacher who has been the head of my PTA association, who has worked statewide around public education, where am I going to get $3.4 million? You have to raise it. And hopefully you have to have some money in the bank when you're coming into your election. But as these gentlemen have already pointed out, because we continue as a community to be so systematically separated from economic opportunities, and we're coming with so much baggage to the table because of white supremacy and the legacy of it, then that, of course, infuses itself in the way in which Black people can show up in the political process. And I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you, but we'll come back around to you because you're starting to help us draw this line, which I'm seeing as economic opportunities happen when policies change. Policies change when people are in place who understand how those policies need to change. Now, let me bring Dr. Stacey Spencer into the conversation, because I think another part of this is getting people of color into political power, but also getting people of color into finance, right? Building communities, not just living in them, and building shopping centers and building businesses. And how do we do that? And I want to pull you in because I know, in addition to being a man of the word, you're also a man of the dollar. And I mean that with the highest respect. So I want to pull you in to talk a little bit about how do you affect change financially in a community in the way that you have.
Well, thank you all for allowing me to be on tonight. All these great scholars giving such great information. I guess I am the token inspirational person on this panel, but it's very important that we own our community. I believe it was Reverend Floyd Flake out of Jamaica, Queens, New York, who told me, you cannot control what you do not own. And as a church, the Greek word for ecclesia simply means stewards over a community. And so we recognized a long time ago in Hickory Hill, where I pastor, that there is 39% poverty, 12% unemployment. When I started the church at age 33, 19 years ago, it was a rapidly changing community. And we recognized in that community some things that were desperately needed right away. And one of those was that the school system was failing our children in the Hickory Hill area. So we set about to start a charter school with 1 grade, the 6th grade class, Power Center Academy, and we focus on entrepreneurship. We taught the kids how to read stock, how to play chess. We partnered with SunTrust Bank for them to open up a banking account so they could know how to manage their money. And then that we added a grade every year until our charter school became the #1 middle school in the whole state of Tennessee several years ago. And now there's about 5,000 students that we serve under a separate 501c3 charter management organization. And then we decided that we needed to do something about the eyesores in our community. We had out-of-town landlords who were allowing eyesores to remain in our community with rat-infested buildings and home invasions. And the mayor approached us at that time, Mayor A.C. Wharton, and he asked me, do you have a vision? If we were to, the city was to give you this old apartment building, Marina Cove, could you do something with it? I'd already shared a vision with my church about a sustainable community where people worked, where people lived, where they went to school. And so they gave us that apartment complex. They demolished it. And then we bought an additional 18 acres behind it, with a total of 43 acres. So we got 40 acres plus the mules that were taken away from us. And so we decided to build a charter school there, middle school. We did a performing arts center there. And we did some affordable homes in partnering with Habitat for Humanity. And we're currently trying to work on getting about 50 or so more affordable homes built there. So we decided that if we're going to change our community, we have to own some stuff. We got to own some land. We got to own some buildings. And we're also focusing on workforce development because we recognize that a lot of people are stuck in poverty. Memphis, 50 years after Dr. King's assassination, Black folk in Memphis are still making 50% less than their white counterparts. So we have not advanced economically. We're still set up on a plantation economy where people are not making a living wage. Thanks be to God, FedEx just announced that they're going to raise theirs to $15 an hour, and we're partnering with them to try to help people get transportation. Transportation is another issue that we're working on. I'm also president of MICA, Memphis Interfaith Coalition for Action and Hope. And there are 3 areas of equity that we're working on in Memphis. Economic equity. We just worked with First Horizon Bank. They were caught redlining, and they are now responsible to redistribute $1.5 billion in West Tennessee. And we've got we had 6 communities that we've identified in Memphis that those resources need to go to so that people can get home loans and begin to transfer wealth to the next generation. We're also working on educational equity, trying to tackle this digital divide. All of our kids are virtual learning right now, but it is a nightmare because a lot of them don't have Wi-Fi and the resources that they need to keep up. Then we're also working on racial equity as it relates to criminal justice reform, militarized policing, holding our police department accountable, and also the disproportionate numbers of Black and brown people who are in the criminal justice system in Memphis. So I'm saying all that to say that the church's role is not just about inspiration, but transformation. If we can change people can change a community. And we are the catalyst. You know, Jesus says that we're supposed to be the salt of the earth. But what good is salt if it's lost its flavor? What good is a church if it never gets out of the salt shaker? And so we're trying to get out and change our community by building social equity. We shut down a nightclub that was backed by drug dealers. We worked with a Latino community where their pastor got robbed, and we wrapped our arms around them. And we adopted a school right across the street from us. to make sure those kids, the literacy rate goes up through a program called Team Read, so that those kids know how to read, because it's been statistically proven that if kids don't learn how to read by 3rd grade, then 39% of them end up in the criminal justice system. And private prisons are already measuring how many prisons they build based upon the literacy rate of Black and brown kids in 2nd and 3rd grade. So we're trying to do our part through economic development, workforce development, being a part of the social justice group I mentioned, Micah. And so in a nutshell, that's what we're doing.
One really quick question for you, and I'm teeing you up, Dr. Perry, because I have a policy question for you based off of what he said. But when in the world do you have time to preach? I say that with the highest respect, because I am amazed by all of the things that you're doing in your community. You talked about education, you talked about building affordable housing, you talked about working with the city, workforce development. You know, it's an impressive example. I say that in jest, of course, and it's an impressive example that I think it's important for us to look at. How do you replicate that? So what I heard was, first you had a vision, because I know you will connect with this. Where there is no vision, the people
perish.
Right. So you had a vision, and then you had access to capital because you had to get started somehow with that first project. So you had a vision, you had access to capital, and then the mayor came knocking on your door and said, "Oh, look what you're doing. Hey, can you help out?" And then you began to replicate that. So my policy question for you, Dr. Perry, is how do we create policies to make more of that happen?
Well, you know, first of all, I want to say, talked about flavor. I better step up on the flavor game. You know, that's why I wore my fancy jacket, but you know, that's not it. But I will say this, that he's tapping into something that we have always known is true. You have to maximize the assets that are around you. Now, what's interesting is that because of devaluation, you can actually purchase land for family and friends dollars, but it's hard to get the money to develop it. But if you are organized, and that can be through a church, that can be through a fraternity, it can be through some kind of social aid and pleasure club. If you organize and mobilize, you can often pull money to actually buy and develop. And we've always done that, from Rosewood to Black Wall Street, Tulsa, to Richmond, to Memphis, to Louisville. We've always done that in spite of policy. And so, first of all, you have to maximize your resources. Second, oftentimes we are in positions of power in Black cities, our city council members, mayors oftentimes. And so we need to rezone areas for development. In addition, know that there are municipal buildings all throughout Black neighborhood that are abandoned. We should be trying to utilize them for our services. If there's one thing that I like about the incubation accelerator space, is that it's the concept is that business owners can work together, pool their resources, learn together, and work together. We need that in the hood all the time. And there's actually facility for that. So we need to convert the abandoned schools, the closed schools, the old municipal buildings into new resources for our communities.
Can I ask you a question on that though? Let's go back a bit. How do you get started? So I have the vision, I have the idea. To me, that roadblock is often, well, it can be two things, but access to capital, because, you know, sometimes you have to have money to make money, right? Yep. So where's the beginning of, where's that building block in the beginning?
I talk a lot about the importance of CDFIs in Black communities, or access to low interest capital. What's harmful is one of the reasons why the wealth gap keeps widening is because in order to start businesses, many Black people have to use uncollateralized debt. So they use credit cards and other things, and that's just hard to overcome, right? Yeah. And so, yes, you do need capital, but I will say this, that sometimes the barriers to capital forces you to just create partnerships and multi-ownership models, cooperatives in name or in deed. And so you see a lot of businesses really start with 5, 6, 7, 8 people. And sometimes we just have to do that. But clearly we need to increase capital. Right now, you're seeing a lot of charity essentially being passed out by corporations all around the country because responding to the uprising across the United States, we need to do a better job of pointing to areas of the country and to people who can utilize that money, because this window is going to shut pretty soon. Because this is my opinion, that the money that you're seeing in corporate America being let out is not really investment. It's more charity, more a response to the political movement. We should try our best to capture it, but that window is going to close.
Yeah.
But for my part, it's the people like Rashawn and I, the Stephanie Browns of the world, Stephanie Brown James of the world. We have to advocate on the policy side to increase the flow of capital to places. But for the entrepreneurs, they got to make it happen regardless of the policy context. So I say, make sure that your policy advocates are doing their job to increase the capital flow to Black neighborhoods, but that shouldn't stop entrepreneurs from, but entrepreneurs, when you're a real entrepreneur, you're not going to stop anyway. You're going to find a way to make it happen.
All right. So one thing that helps me, I keep lists of things in my head. And right now I'm keeping a list of solutions that I have heard tonight, starting with your keynote, Dr. Perry. One of the last things you said, but it was poignant to me, which is support your Black businesses by making sure you give them good reviews, which will drive more business and more customers there, which will help make them more successful. Stephanie Brown James, I heard you talking about getting more people of color, poor people, people of color, into women, into government positions where we can affect that type of change. And then building on what Dr. Ray and Dr. Spencer were both talking about, Dr. Perry, I heard you say, number one, don't wait for the policies to change. We're working on that, but don't wait for the policies to change. And also don't try to do it by yourself, right? I want to open a barber shop. I don't have a place. I don't have enough money. But maybe 2, 3, 4 people who can help you finance that is what I'm hearing you say. So we are starting to get some audience questions, and I encourage the audience to drop those questions in, because I think the value of panels like this is when you can walk away and say, now I have a better understanding of the thing that I came to hear. So we've got a few questions here. I'm going to throw it out to you all. Whoever would like to address them is fine. The shift from middle class to upper class tends to be more difficult than the transition from working class to middle class, this person asked. So what is your advice to generations that are trying to move from middle to upper class, given the fact that shifts sometimes? Why, first of all, do you agree with that? And why does that tend to be more difficult? And what do we do about it?
Well, there's a hollowing of the middle class. That's been noted by a lot of scholars. So the number of poor people, a number of wealthy people are increasing on the tails. And that has a lot to do with the model wealth creation. So if you do have capital and you can manage that capital, say through a 401k plan or something like that, that accelerates wealth. Remember, most Black people generated wealth through home ownership. When the Great Recession occurred, that wealth was wiped out. So one of the lessons that we've learned from this, yes, we do. I want folks to own homes, but we also need to diversify. We also need to figure out ways to develop wealth in all other ways, owning businesses, investing in the stock market, but there has to be other ways to create wealth.
Well, that's a good point, because, just relying on that equity that's building up in the home, then all of a sudden, the economy shifts and you just don't have access to that anymore. All right, here's another question from one of our viewers tonight. Does the astronomical dollar amount to raise for political positions strike fear into sponsors giving to Black candidates? Stephanie Brown James, you talked about this. It costs a lot of money to, I'm actually involved in some school board races. That's kind of low level, very low level, but you have to raise a lot of money to just get started. Does that scare away sponsors? How do you get started? How do you start raising that $1 million to, run for county position, county executive, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it absolutely, I think, scares a lot of folks and creates fear. But, I believe that fear can fund focus, and it makes you focus on where do I need to go to find the pockets of money to be able to have an effective campaign to represent my communities. And I mean, so I'm fortunate to be the co-founder of an organization called the Collective PAC that supports Black candidates running for office across the country. And we just commissioned a study this year around Black donors and the 2020 presidential campaign. And what we've seen just this year through the primary season is that Black people, about 2 million Black people donated $41 million on the Democratic side to fuel their candidate in the primaries. $41 million, which sounds, again, like an astronomical amount. But the average amount that these donors gave was $21. And so it may seem as though the barrier of entry is one that would prohibit participation, but if anything, it's one that can fuel the need to be out in the community, to be known, to participate within your community so that you can build up that grassroots effort of support to fund your campaign. And ideally, you want to have as many donors as possible from your community that you're running for your state, because dollars equal support. And so it helps you along the way for your campaign. But, I don't believe that, we should allow anything that fears us to deter us. If anything, it should, help us to see the need for us to continue to widen our tent. The last thing I will say, though, is, and that $41 million amount really showed that Black people give proportional to how many of us are participating in politics. And so another serious challenge we have, though, is that when you have institutions that rely on that money, and it's not just candidates that folks give to, they give to different organizations. We're seeing that so many organizations that do grassroots organizing or does technology for campaigns aren't hiring Black firms, they're not hiring Black organizers, they're not hiring Black companies to do that civic engagement work. And so there's so many different levels when it comes to the economic impact in politics. I mean, one serious way that we need to show support is by giving Black companies, Black firms, Black people the opportunity to participate on the back end side of politics, which is something that we're not seeing in great deal right now.
Well, I think what you're saying is very similar to what Dr. Perry said, which was, essentially on a much higher level, crowdsourcing, right? Crowdsource that business, crowdsource your campaign, and tap into your community, because oftentimes as you 41 million, that's a lot of money, so the money was there, it was just there in $21 chunks everywhere.
And that's just the primaries. That doesn't even count how much Black people have given to local and state candidates.
Wow. That's amazing. So I think that walks a little bit into the next question that we have from an audience member, which is, so this one gets a little bit into COVID and some of the long-term effects in terms of the economy. Given that primary education is the springboard for higher learning and increased wealth, how will COVID affect the youngest members of the African American society and their aspirations for the future? I'm the mom of a high school senior. I'm trying to figure out, how do we get into college right now? How do we pay for college? What are those grades going to be looking like when you're taking the classes from home? A lot of these things. But even when you look at the younger generation, right, we are going to come out of this with some educational gaps for everyone. But those students who were already challenged and disadvantaged are going to have even larger educational gaps. So is that going to, I think what this question is getting at, is that going to have a snowball effect on preparing our children to be those entrepreneurs and to be those leaders that we want them to be? Dr. Spencer, I know I want to bring you back in the conversation. I know you've been working a lot with education. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the impact on our young people it's really devastating. I have a senior in high school, and I can just see the fatigue in his eyes in terms of not being able to connect with his friends. His plans for trying to secure a football scholarship are questionable because their schedule's interrupted. But I look at my son as just a small picture of all of our children who are impacted by this COVID-19. We have, as a church, opened up our empty children's building for about 100 kids whose parents are essential workers, to wrap our arms around them, to help them with the virtual learning piece and to help them with wraparound services, because this is affecting them psychologically and educationally. And so we try to wrap our arms around them to help them. And I think if all of us, all of the fraternities, sororities, churches, all of our Black organizations would wrap our arms around our kids, they need that more than ever. It literally will take a village to help raise one child because of this pandemic that we're going through. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said because the football season, like in Memphis, the football season has been halted in Memphis City schools. And young people are irate. You want to know why? Because a lot of those young men are dependent on athletic scholarships.
Absolutely.
To find a way out of their poverty. And so it's devastating for them to think this was my only way out. On the flip side of that is an opportunity for us to relook at how we do education. Everybody may not be college bound. And so maybe this is a time for us to shore up on vocational training for jobs that kids can get right out of high school. We interviewed some of the kids at Power Center Academy and found out that many of them needed money immediately. They hadn't even thought about college because they needed to go and contribute to the bottom line in their families and make money immediately. So that made us start thinking about workforce development in terms of robotics or computers or air condition or masonry or boiler makers. And that entrepreneurship can build a foundation of wealth that they can build upon and pursue their education later if they wanted to. But this is a perfect opportunity for us to wrap our arms around our young people and to come up with other alternatives in securing a more viable financial future for them.
Dr. Ray, I want to ask you a policy question about that, but I have to tell you, Dr. Spencer, you hit an issue that is so close to my heart because when I'm not reporting for NBC, I'm a PTA mom and I spend a lot of time in our community advocating for things just like that. And so it's really even at a much younger age, in high school, my son, the son that I was talking about, the senior, he's in a career technology program in high school where he's learning to be an electrician. He's learning how to build a house. He's been wiring up a house. My daughter went through a similar program. She graduated with her CNA license. So if college wasn't for her, she has a means of taking care of herself. And I think part of that is encouraging families to look at those options. But part of it is those of us who deal with policy to push and make sure that those options are available in our school systems and in our community. So my question for you, Dr. Ray, is policies. And I really want to, maybe we can do sort of a final round robin and I'll ask this question of everyone. But when we talk about policies being barriers, what policies? Give me some examples. What kinds of policies are we talking about? And what can we do to affect change?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about wealth, and since we were just talking about education, I think right now a big barrier is access to technology. So, I mean, there are a lot of kids who are in neighborhoods who don't have access to technology. They don't have Wi-Fi. They don't have devices. There was a very troubling image of a group of kids sitting outside of a fast food restaurant trying to get Wi-Fi, and a police officer came up and accosted them. I mean, those are the types of things that shouldn't necessarily be happening. So we know that that is the barrier when it comes to education. When people do have the opportunity to go on for higher education, a big barrier is the fact that they have to take out student loans. Black people compared to white people are more likely to have to take out student loans because of everything that Andre laid out, which is the fact that oftentimes when people are getting ready to go to college, their parents will take out a home equity line of credit in the home and pay for college. That is less likely to happen when you're Black. That is then coupled with the fact that if you attend a historically Black college, you are more likely to get an unsubsidized loan and a loan oftentimes with a higher interest rate. All of these things compound to end up creating a gap oftentimes between the have and the have not. So if we're going to do something about it, I think there's one big thing. One of our colleagues at Brookings, Nicole Turner-Lee, on the education front, she said that we need to equip school buses with Wi-Fi. Austin, Texas has done this. Places in the Midwest have done this. School buses are just sitting oftentimes behind a gate right now. Imagine if they are set up on their bus route, equipped with Wi-Fi. You get the cable company that supplies that area the most because they have monopolies on these areas. And then all of a sudden you get them to give tablets. Now you have done something about this gap that is going to happen during COVID. When it comes to school loans, I'm definitely a big advocate of student loan forgiveness, particularly for people entering various sorts of programs, whether that be through the federal government, whether that be going into healthcare, something related to the military, or even the academy, to forgive their student loans. That definitely will catapult Black people oftentimes out of an issue as it relates to debt. And then when it comes to home ownership, what we really need to do in all of these facets is to deal with discrimination that is embedded in the process. From the fact when our homes are appraised, to the fact when we go to a bank and give them our zip code, it's not about our credit score, oftentimes how much money we can put down. It's literally where we are planning to buy, and the fact that we are Black, and we end up with a subprime loan or a loan with a higher interest rate that you go throughout the course of a 30-year loan, a 30-year mortgage, could end up costing $100,000 to $250,000 or more, depending on where you are. So rather than what is happening right now at the federal level in the White House, where they're aiming to roll back certain forms of legislation and understanding and workshops around racial equity, we need to double down on that to ensure that racial equity is premium when people are transitioning through these gateways from education to work to home ownership to healthcare and the like, to ensure that people are being treated equally. Because I mean, as Andre always says, there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. And so we have to deal with that if we want people to continue to be able to actualize the American dream.
I love a number of things you said there, including using those school buses essentially as hotspots, right? And sending them out in the communities. And some communities are doing that. But I think, like many of the things that we talked about tonight, the issue is replicating and scaling up so we don't have little spots of success here and there. But so we really start to see some community-wide and some nationwide initiatives that support success, particularly for communities of color. Okay, Dr. Perry, it's your turn. Policies that need to change.
Yeah, well, since my colleague Rashawn Ray took all my education mojo, I'm going to take some of his criminal justice work because I actually am surprised he did not mention policing reform, because it's one of the biggest wealth extractors in a community. Nothing says that a Black person doesn't belong in the community like a police officer shooting a Black man in the middle of the street. And not only that, the fines, the fees, from the criminal justice system, that's wealth extracting. So we need reform. When I hear the phrase or the belief system of defund the police, what I hear is we need to reprioritize budget in ways to meet the needs of Black community. So we have that now, and Ray and Pastor is absolutely right. We need to figure out ways to get rid of bad debt. So cancellation of student loans, cancellation of healthcare bills that pile up. These are the things that really are keeping Black folk behind in terms of the wealth gap. In addition, we do need different kinds of loan products for homes. Now, there's lots of homes that are priced so low that banks won't back them. So we need a new kind of mortgage product and credit scoring system that enables a low-income worker who pays their bill on time to purchase that $30,000 home. And in places like Memphis, there are thousands of them ready to move in. Because in some places, there's not an inventory issue. It's just that there's not a mortgage product that is usable until somebody comes in and buys up a bunch of a property. I'll give one more. How can I forget? part of the equation is mobilizing. When MLK died, he was mobilizing sanitation workers. And there's no question about it. When you look at who actually has wealth in the Black community, a lot of the middle class is comprised of people who actually work in public sector jobs. Mm-hmm. So all those folks who are essential workers, we got to convert to some kind of public sector position. And we got to demand that certain professions that are currently not getting the kind of benefits that enables them to get a 401k to get a 401k. And in lots of places, City Hall included, you do an inventory of their workers, a lot of them are working poor. Don't have me go to these corporations and do an inventory of their employees. You see working poor. So we got to demand that those folks have the kind of benefit packages that keeps them, that puts them into the middle class.
You walked right into the thing I want to ask Stephanie Brown James, because she is our grassroots voice and vision here tonight, in part because of the work that you do. And I'm thinking particularly about women of color. You know, we talked at the beginning about this intersection of social justice issues and economic justice issues. And I think sometimes nowhere is that more evident than with women, because we work, we have childcare, challenges, and it all impact, women largely are still, the primary, we deal with kids, basically is what I'm saying. We deal with healthcare. So healthcare policies, childcare policies. Well, I don't want to answer your question, but I'm just throwing it out there to say what policies, and particularly, policies that would affect women of color need to change or need to be adjusted to see some economic justice here.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I would say, the first one is the wage gap. The fact that Black women make 62 cents on the dollar of what a white man makes is absurd. You look at a state like Mississippi, where Black women get 56 cents on a dollar for what a white man makes, but yet she's expected to make that 56 cents work at the same way that dollar works. And so, there are a number of policies that, we look at the Family Leave Act. You have men and women who aren't able to take a leave from their jobs when they have a family emergency, when they're having a baby, and they have to take that economic cut, but they can't afford essentially to have that baby because they need their job to survive, because their job may not have a family leave protection. And so there's a number of specific policies, and I think if there's anything I want to hone in on today is it's the importance of that we as voters have the ability to have a say-so on policies. I always say, to change the laws, we must change the lawmakers. But to progress forward, we must participate in the process. And that means that we must participate in politics. And I think people hear the word politics and it means just, folks running for Congress or folks running for mayor or for president. But politics is every day. It's a 365 situation, because every single thing in so many respects that impact our day-to-day lives is a decision made by somebody, which turns into policies. And so you may not be a person that wants to run for office, but you can definitely donate. And most importantly, you can show up to talk to the people who are put in office. We talk a lot about lobbying. Lobbying has a kind of a bad, gets a bad rap. Lobbying essentially is being able to communicate how you feel around certain issues and really ask for what it is that you want to see as far as changes in your community. But finally, there are a number of ways in which you can participate in your local politics. And just as a quick example, almost every city has some form of boards and commissions that you can sit on. And so we mentioned that folks may go the PTA route if you're going to be involved in education, but do you know that, there's, I'm from Cleveland originally. They have an advisory committee on persons with disabilities, homeless services, workforce development, community-based correctional facility governing, council on equity, how we utilize land, how do we reutilize land. There's so many ways in which you can participate in the process, but again, participation is key. I mean, we're really at a place where, you know, we need everyone to do something to be able to make lives better for everyone.
You're talking about civic engagement, and you're right. People hear politics and they think, you know, the nastiness that's happening in Washington. It's hard not to, or they think I'm not going to run for anything. I'm not a campaign type person. One of the things I told you, I'm the PTA mom. Really very much so now. And one of the things on the National PTA board that we advocate for is making sure that people are civically engaged, you know, whoever that is, wherever that is, and at whatever level. I think that's really important. So we have one last question, and it's about HBCU. So I know we have some Bison on the panel. I heard it before this all started. I'm just gonna go ahead and let you get that out.
Thank you.
There were a couple of you, I remember. I forgot who it was. So this is going to be our last question. How do we prepare the next generation to eliminate economic inequities? What is the role of HBCUs in cultivating professionals who can see and address this? Dr. Ray, you talked about this a little bit. Dr. Spencer, if you have some thoughts on this, please jump in, because I got a time cue and I shorted you on that last question. But how can our HBCUs help address this?
Well, you know, can I add, let me add this. I won't talk about preparedness, but I'll talk about the importance of HBCUs to economic development. We all know that higher education shields communities from recessions, meaning that when a recession hits, folks who work in an HBCU, folks who, or a college or university, folks in the town are better equipped. And so when you have an HBCU in your proximity, that's an asset you should build upon. And so we also need to talk about the land that HBCUs hold. We also need to talk about the services they can provide to the community. So I'm not going to talk about the education. I'm going to talk about the benefits that an HBCU can provide to Black communities. Of the 100 HBCUs, about half of them are actually in Black majority cities. And so we got to figure out when it's time to expand broadband, maybe that hub should be the HBCU. When we are developing, when the HBCU gets that money to develop the area, maybe they should think about the commercial corridor, placing the commercial corridor next to the HBCU. So I think oftentimes we just talk about sort of the curriculum and instruction that goes on in a college. But remember,
you're talking about using it as a resource, as a
resource, as an economic driver in itself.
Okay, we're going to end doing something that is usually impossible. Pastor Spencer, I'm going to give you the last word, but I think we only have 30 seconds to a minute. I know how this goes. When you tell a pastor you got 30 seconds, that doesn't happen. But we're going to try it. I want to give you the last word on I know you're good for any final thoughts.
I think this is a wonderful time for Black folk to circle together and to maximize opportunities to build wealth. Going back to the HBCUs, I think that they could be incubators for how we think about wealth building. We have to make sure. I'm encouraged by Deion Sanders going to Jackson State University. He's a multimillionaire, and yet he is investing his time and talent into his own. That's what it's going to take. My son is a student at Xavier in New Orleans. And the thing that sold me on them is they said, we will not let your son fail. And I think we don't let our children fail by making sure that we empower them with economic literacy, that we make sure that's part of the curriculum in our HBCUs. How do we build wealth for the next generation? But we also need to make sure we don't fall for the okie doke. And that is, I've heard that Xavier and Dillard are promoting, trying to get the students to take the trial vaccine. We cannot allow Tuskegee to happen up under our nose again. And so I'm hoping that the presidents of those universities will think twice about experimenting on our kids. These need to be incubators of building future leaders and future wealth transfers instead of places where they experiment on us. Those days are over.
I didn't put a clock on you, but I think you did it. Dr. Stacy Spencer, Dr. Andrew Perry, Stephanie Brown James, Dr. Rashawn Ray, thank you all so much for being part of this conversation tonight. It was a rich conversation, and the thing that I like about it, it was solutions focused. Dr. Perry did a great job of laying out the numbers for us in the beginning, but I think people will be able to walk away with some ideas of what they can do and where they can go next to achieve economic justice. So I thank you all. And we want to end on an empowering note to you. So imagine an America where we don't have these issues. Imagine an America where we don't have this massive wealth gap. Imagine an America where we don't have these types of policies because, as you all talked about, we have the people in place to affect the policies. That is what the National Civil Rights Museum and that is what community leaders are trying to get to. Imagine in America is a new campaign by the Civil Rights Museum to try to get more people civically engaged, to try to get more people to vote. Last time around in 2016, the Black voter turnout was 59.6%. That's just over half. We can do better. We will do better on November 3rd, hopefully. So I want to leave you with that thought, which I feel is an empowering thought because it tells us that we actually have the power to make some of these changes happen. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience for joining us tonight.
Thank you.